to be helpful. So the session is the ACEI Create panel on a future for the creative economy. It's jointly organized with CREATE. CREATE is the research councils of the UK Centre for Copyright and New Business Models in the Creative Economy, based at the University of Glasgow. It was set up to investigate the future of creative production in the digital age, and in particular the role of copyright. And I'm a fellow in cultural economics at CREATE, and also Professor of Economics of Creative Industries at the Centre for IP Policy Management and Policy at Bournemouth University. So it's quite a mouthful. Now, unfortunately, my colleague from Glasgow, Gillian Doyle, is unable to be here with us, and Christian Handke, with whom I've worked for many years, very kindly agreed to replace her yesterday. So the title of this panel session is somewhat portentous, but it's not intended that way. What we hope for is an informed and informal discussion of what modern economics has to say about the directions of markets for creative goods and services in our ever-changing economy. The term creative economy can be interpreted very widely, and indeed is, but creativity, even narrowly defined, takes place in the wider economy, and it is important to grasp the implications of technological change throughout the economy for the cultural sector. It's therefore important to connect with the way that economists perceive the effect of digitization and the internet, which one might regard as two separate issues, on markets and on their regulation. Now, as we all know, the production and consumption of creative goods and services has been profoundly disrupted by digitization and the internet. In our areas of interest in cultural economics, digitization and digitalization, i.e. digitizing that which was not natively digital, has meant that museums can be visited from your PC, opera is widely available at the local cinema, and games are now being used to support high art. But as economists, we know that things will not stop there. Technical progress has taken place ever since the Stone Age. Digitization and the internet as means of reproducing and distributing information goods, including creative goods and services, are not the first and will not be the last disruptive influences. Regulation in the creative industries is first and foremost through copyright, and that is struggling to keep up with current changes. It may have to alter fundamentally, but in doing so, it's very important that the shape of future markets in the creative industries is understood and informs that discussion. We know that art, dance, music, storytelling, and play acting have always existed and will continue to do so in one form or another, though there are bound to be changes in their finance and economic organization. Cultural economists are well informed about these changes, but in my view, there's a tendency to study specific markets or art forms, such as symphony concerts, built heritage, films, and so on, without looking at the creativity as a whole and the economic theories that relate to it. Very often, the focus has been, and still is, on the subsidized arts. So what we want to do here is to consider the application of recent theories in industrial organization to the cultural sector as a whole, and to think about the implications for finance, artist labor markets, audiences, and so on. Now, many of the topics studied in industrial organizations, such as platform pricing, network effects, long tail, price discrimination, customization, and so on, clearly apply to markets for creative goods. And indeed, authors writing in industrial organization, including our distinguished panelists here, have done just that. The hope is that these theories could be more widely applied in cultural economics in a sort of two-way dialogue with industrial organization specialists. Now, two experiences are the motivation for this panel, which was jointly planned with Gillian Doyle. First, when Christian and I edited the Handbook of the Digital Creative Economy, we realized that there'd not been very much work done on the effect of digitization in cultural economics. Now, that was in 2012, but I don't see that there's been so much work since then. Second, and more recently, and more a topic that I'm concerned with, is that discussions among law professors on the future of copyright seem to take place without a parallel discussion on the shape of the market for the creative economy to which copyright applies. Copyright is held to be vital to the creative economy, but its role could change with new forms of economic organization. And indeed, maybe we need more emphasis on the role of competition law rather than copyright. Now, when I started teaching a course in what was then called cultural industries at Erasmus University in Rotterdam in the year 2000, which was before Cave's book came out, we used Shapiro and Varian's 1999 textbook, Information Rules. And of course, the information economy, the information society was the big phrase then. Then the knowledge economy, now we've got the creative economy. Shapiro and Varian made a very strong statement in the focus of their book, which was, while technology may change, economic laws do not. The book introduced economic features of internet markets, things I'd never heard of at the time, such as bundling, versioning, personalized pricing, and so on, all of which came about. The important point was that while everybody was carried away with the dot-com boom, they've held fast to the insights of economics, and they were right. Of course, economics has moved on, but many of the old discussions still underlie the new ones and are familiar in cultural economics. Marginal cost pricing with sunk costs, which, by the way, I'm old enough to have learnt in the first place as railway economics. Two-part tariffs, externalities of which network effects are only one aspect. Scalability, returns to scale, very much an issue in the performing arts, and one that is being transformed by digital delivery. And regulation of monopoly on the negative side, but also copyright law as an incentive, or supposed incentive. So the implications of the new take by industrial organization on these and related issues for the traditional concerns of cultural economics, the finance of the arts and creativity, for access to culture and so on, are the future of our subject, in my opinion. I believe that there's the possibility of a unified approach to the whole range of cultural industries, creative industries, which cultural and media economics are well set to embrace, and in doing so, to inform the economics profession about this intriguing area of the economy. So enough from me. I should come clean and say this has been quite a journey for me, and I'm actually amazed at my temerity at inviting such experts. I think I have probably learnt more about this than anyone else will, but that's good. So on my left is Françoise Benhamou, very well known to everyone in cultural economics, but we think we know people, but we don't necessarily know. She's an expert in cultural economics, but she's also a member of ARCEP, which is the French regulator of communications, the French equivalent of the FCC. Marc Bourreau is professor of economics and director of innovation, of the Innovation Regulation Chair at Telecom Paris Tech, where he specializes in industrial economics, regulation, telecommunications, and digital economics. He was one of the authors, I think I'm right, Mark, about this, in the 2013 paper that won the Pomerania Prize? I thought so. So although he's new to us here, which we very much welcome, his work has already been published in our journal. Christian Handke is also well known to you. He's assistant professor in cultural economics at Erasmus University Rotterdam in the School of History, Culture and Communication. And finally, Joel Waldvogel holds the Frederick R. Kappel Chair, I beg your pardon, your mouthful's even as bad as mine, in Applied Economics, Strategic Management and Entrepreneurship at the Carlson School of Management at the University of Minnesota. He's done important empirical studies on price, advertising, media markets, operation, all sorts of things, including piracy, pricing, revenue sharing. In fact, many of the topics we're here to discuss. So we're very pleased to welcome you all, in fact, to this session. Now, each person was asked to make a short introductory statement, and then we'll proceed to questions from the floor. I want this to be a very open discussion. All the panelists are prepared to answer questions. They'll probably want to talk among themselves a little bit, but we also really look forward to questions from the floor. So can I start with Joel on my right, who's come, I think, the furthest to join us, and very welcome, Joel.
Well, thank you very, very much for the introduction and for the invitation. So the charge here is to talk about the future of the creative industries in 5 to 7 minutes, and without PowerPoint, and I promise to obey at least one of those agreements. Okay, so we are in a period of rapid change brought about by changing technology that goes under the broad heading of digitization. To think about how digitization is affecting cultural industries, it's important just to remind ourselves briefly of what the old model of bringing cultural products, movies, music, books, among others, to market. Large investments required, especially for movies. In the US, it's $100 million to bring a big movie to market. But it's similarly large, not quite as large, for other products. In any event, that model of production requires permission from gatekeepers who have access to distribution resources and the money to finance things. So that's the old model. You need a gatekeeper to give you permission and financing, and then you can bring a product to market. Well, I'd like to talk about the future, and I think that to understand the future, we need to think about how the world would work if one no longer needed gatekeepers. I should also say, predicting the future is hard. I guess quoting that famous American philosopher, it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. Which philosopher is that? That's Yogi Berra, Yankees catcher. Okay, well, the recent past and the future, I think, is a story of what happens when new technologies make it possible to bring creative products without those permissions. And this is a rosy view of technology, which frankly is not the way new technologies have been perceived by players in the industry. They have perceived new technologies as an existential threat to which they have fought fiercely. Technology always seems to arrive as a threat, well, in any event. So what I'll talk about in my remaining 3 minutes, I'll talk about a minute about when the future arrived in 1999, the threat of Napster. Then I'll talk for a few more minutes about the effects of digitization on creativity, or creation, I should say, in the form of the number of products created and their quality as perceived by consumers. And then I'll finish just talking a little bit about some current struggles associated with other aspects of digitization that have brought about ubiquitous distribution, both within and across countries. So the future arrived, in my view, in 1999, so here we are 16 years into the future. But really, Napster is a technology that allows consumption without payment. Now, it took a bunch of academics to make this into a question: what would be the impact of a technology that allowed consumption without payment? And so there was quite a struggle. I'd call it a kerfuffle, an academic kerfuffle, to demonstrate that, in fact, the ability to steal reduces revenue. And yes, it does seem all sane people seem to agree with that at this point. Revenue is down in music by 2/3 in the US and Europe. It's a calamity if you are a producer of music. And all the policy discussion and most of the research discussion has really been about this calamity, and in particular, the need for strengthening IP protection to restore adequate incentives to create. Okay, so let's keep that thought in mind. Well, an epiphany that I had about 5 years ago now was that this revenue question, while it's kind of important for industry, incumbent players, is actually utterly the wrong question for public policy. Copyright allows this evil of monopoly in order to get something good in return, adequate incentives for the continued creation of good new products, whatever that means. Well, digitization is a two-edged sword, which included all that bad news on the demand side. People can now steal. But maybe some good news on the supply side. Maybe it's cheaper to produce, to promote, to distribute. And so it becomes a horse race, an empirical horse race. What really happens then with the full force of digitization? So the research I've really focused on is to try to quantify what has happened. And I would say, even today, to pose the question that maybe technology has brought good news in the creative industries remains heresy. Especially when the Recording Industry Association is in the room. All right, so what are the relevant empirical questions? Well, first, I think if costs have fallen more than revenue has fallen, then there ought to be a growth in the number of new products. And I won't bore you too much, but I'll just say we see enormous growth in the number of new products. In music, there's been a tripling between, say, 2000 and about 2010, a tripling in the number of new products brought to market each year. In other industries, we've seen similar enormous amounts of growth. The other industries haven't typically seen as much of a threat from piracy. So there, you just have good news in the form of reduced costs, but in the explosive growth in the number of new books, largely driven by books that are self-published and digital. Very, very large growth in the number of new movies. This is not as well understood, but the number of new movies brought to market available to consumers has increased by at least a factor of 10. We could quibble about how best to define a product, but there's surely been great growth, and similar things have been happening in other video markets like television. Now, you might at this point say, but is any of this new stuff any good? You know, is it all just, as they say, cats on Roombas? You know, the YouTube videos with cats riding those automatic vacuum cleaners? Are those movies? Or is it all just the Blair Witch Project, which, by the way, was successful, although I think of it as a very low-quality product. All right, well, let me talk a little bit about that, and I'll get done soon, but there's an important element that cultural products share, which is unpredictability. At the time the investments are being made, it's very hard to know which ones will be successful. And so if that's true, then that means that if we make a whole bunch of new products, then although many of them might be quite poor, some of them might be quite good. And if when we make a whole bunch of new products and some of them turn out to be quite good, that could be very important for consumers. Now, when you think that digitization, construed broadly, includes in part a reduction in the cost of taking a draw from that creative earn, meaning making a product and bringing it to market, then maybe there's going to be some big good news here. Well, that's all just an hypothesis. So is it true? How would we know if it's true? Well, one thing would be growth in the number of products. This fly really likes me. Get out of here. This is the fly from Big Media. Go away, Big. Okay. Anyways. Yeah. But so we already saw lots of new products, and including among the new products, and this is sort of important, a lot of the new products include products that would previously not have made it to market. And I'll refer to those as ex-ante losers. All right, a lot of new products, including ex-ante losers. But the second questions we have to ask, are the new products good or useful to consumers? And finally, do the ex-ante losers account for a large and growing share of the ex-post winners? So I'll just talk briefly about that. And I should say, in an audience of cultural economists, that when I use the word quality, I really don't mean aesthetic quality. So before you start jumping on me, I just mean whatever it makes people want to buy stuff. Right? So it's quality if people like it. So let's just calibrate here. Britney Spears is high quality. 50 Shades of Grey is high quality. So now you know what I mean by quality, and we don't have to have a fight. But seriously, I mean, understanding what delivers welfare to consumers is important to an economist, a cultural economist as well. So thinking about how to measure quality is hard, and doing it is hard. Thinking about it is easy. I have two broad ways to do it. One, it involves critics and what critics think of the output when they compare the output over time, the vintage from this year versus that. And so there are a lot of critics' best of lists one can rely on. There's also direct usage data. Consumers in many of these markets have access to today's products and yesterday's products in any given year, so we can see how well various vintages do conditional on their age and learn something about the apparent quality of products. And using those kinds of approaches, and again, I haven't told you enough to convince you yet, but I see evidence the service flow from new products in these industries has really risen sharply since the dawn of digitization. In addition, the number of sort of movies and TV shows that critics really like produced per year has risen sharply. And in addition to that, a very important condition for my story being right was that the ex-ante losers account for a growing share of ex-post winners. And that is surely true. If you look at best-selling music, growing share from independent record labels. Similarly, growing share of the successful movies coming not from the traditional quarters. Same thing's true in television. It's astounding what's happened to television. Books maybe even more so. With books, if you look at the bestseller list in the last few years in the US, more than 10% of the titles among the 150 bestsellers per week are books that originally appeared as self-published books. That is astounding. In the romance category, it's over 40%. Now, we might think of this stuff as trash culturally, but economically, this stuff is a big deal, and it really is the circumvention of gatekeepers that has happened. I like to quote Tom Petty here to say that even the losers get lucky sometimes. Ex-ante losers being ex-post winners. Okay. That one works better with PowerPoint. All right, so where are we? I'm almost done. Despite the pain of a lot of incumbent players who are loud and vociferous in the policy debate, we are living in a golden age of cultural production in books, music, movies, and television. Now, what's next? And should I shut up now, or should I?
No,
okay. All right. All right, so I mean, so if you think about kind of bringing the future to the present as opposed to the future that began in 1999, digitization has enabled streaming bundled sales of music, movies, and books to an increasing extent, and it raises a bunch of important questions, two of which I'll just talk briefly about. One is, well, how big is the revenue pie when we add the revenue from streaming to the revenue from selling, let's say, permanent downloads in the case of music? And then, sort of what's the effect of these new modes of distribution on total rights holder revenue? And the key issue there is the extent to which the revenue, or the new consumption, via streaming, let's say, displaces consumption via the old mechanisms. The second question is about national borders. If things really become ubiquitously available, it presents us with sort of the most feared threat to cultural protection ever. So we've got to think about how those things work. Now, on the streaming and sales displacement question, it's kind of hard for a number of reasons, partly because a lot of the data are secret. But in some work I've done with colleagues at the IPTS in Seville, it looks as though there's a rough offset. That is to say that the increased revenue from streaming seems to be about balanced by decreased revenue from sales of permanent downloads. And so, in one sense, one might declare victory, that streaming is sort of some good news that's generating revenue. Although, when you think about streaming, stand back and think about bundled sales of digital products, zero marginal cost digital products. These are products where the value of the bundle of everything to consumers is enormous. Having revenue neutrality, is that success or is that not success? It's sort of an interesting question. So I'll make a prediction here, which is that rights holders in the next round of negotiations with the intermediaries are going to ask for much higher payments per stream. I think they view this as a failure. One last deep dive, then I finish. On this question of creative products and borders, we're living in interesting times here. You may have noticed that earlier this year, Netflix expanded to 244 countries, a number, I think, exceeding the number of countries on the planet, although not including China. Now, it raises an interesting question. What happens when Netflix is available everywhere except China? Is it a U.S. hegemon, extending U.S. products in, sort of ramming them down the throats of every consumer in the world, or is it a facilitator of digital frictionless trade, allowing me to watch Danish movies in the U.S.? Well, I suppose it's both. But if you look at it carefully and what's available and so forth, it's really mostly the former. It's mostly ending up as a U.S. hegemon, at least for now. But it's far from clear that's the end of the story. You may have noticed that Netflix is now producing content in Spanish, Narcos, in French, Marseille, in Japanese, Atelier. So we'll see whether Netflix is a U.S. hegemon or a hegemon of the median world consumer. It's early days. A related kind of question concerns Spotify, not as ubiquitously available as Netflix, but in many big countries. And what it does for consumers, it gives them access to almost everything and virtually the same large catalog where you can consume that, you can try another song for no additional payment. So this is really kind of wonderful for consumers, but if you think about cultural protectionism and the traditional ways in which we have protected our domestic economies, this is a nightmare. People can have everything they want. I mean, maybe they'll just listen to nothing but Britney Spears. But let me make a prediction, which is that, and based on some recent work that I've been doing, preferences remain different enough in different countries that I don't think there's all that much to worry about. I think national repertoires will remain strong, especially given what I talked about a few minutes ago, that the cost of producing has fallen so much that even if with less revenue, there would still be healthy domestic cultural sectors. Okay, so finishing up, we're living in interesting times. It's a golden age for consumers, although there are still some producers and intermediaries who are unhappy, and ubiquitous availability is scary, but probably mostly good.
Thank you very much, Joel. Now, shall we just have one question to Joel from somebody in the audience, just to show willing that we're trying to be interactive? Marina Bianchi, thank you.
You didn't mention the constraint on the part of consumers. Where did the consumer find the time to consume all these goods?
Should I answer that?
Yes, or anyone can answer it.
Well, so it's always been hard to learn about products. There have always been more products.
Oh, sorry.
That's right. That's my cue to shut up. But there have always been way more products than consumers could learn about. And so it's a really good question. And how is it we're going to learn about all this new stuff? But if you think about it, the technology of discovery has actually made it arguably much cheaper. Because now, if 10 people find something on YouTube and like it, it only takes sort of a small number of people listening to say, hey, I like this, and to communicate that to their friends. The old model was somebody chooses, a program director chooses to play it on the radio, causing 100,000 people to have to listen to it. That's 100,000 times 3 minutes is a lot of spent time. It has to be played a few times before we figure out whether we like it. And so if you think about the cost of discovery in the old world versus the new, although your question remains a good, interesting, open question, I just want to say it's not at all obvious to me that the cost of discovery has gone up. Because now we can do discovery in a decentralized way, and via social whatever, we can share this information. And so with the same amount of time spent consuming, we can just consume things we like more.
Well, we now see how controversial this is. Françoise,
Yeah. So, thank you, Ruth, for inviting me to join this panel. I will stress 2 or 3 points in order to illustrate the disruption in cultural industries due to digitization. And one of the most interesting points that was emphasized by Joël is probably the rise in self-production in music, in books, in video, etc. And for example, for books, 31% of e-book sales on Amazon Kindle store were self-published books. And self-published authors are not only in science fiction, in fantasy, in romance, but also they have taken significant market shares in all genres. And they are today a significant part of the book publishing landscape. And what is interesting is to observe how companies try to answer to this new phenomenon. And they have taken this change into account in 3 manners. The first one, the first degree, is to consider platforms as a place where they identify authors and talents. And agents try to be intermediaries in this new landscape. This is the first degree. The second degree is to try to open inside the traditional publishing house a department dedicated to self-publishing. And it's a kind of paradox. And Random House, which is the world's largest publisher, tried to do so, but decided finally to withdraw from this business, admitting the difficulty to compete with Amazon platform. And it was in January 2016. But I think that it is not the end of the story. And the third degree is to consider that it is impossible to go on working as before. And the whole business model must evolve. And we see some publishers who try to transform their publishing house with new supply bundles, with both digitized e-books and paper books, with subscriptions, with new contracts with authors. It can be short-term contracts, taking into account all the sources of revenues of authors. And for example, if e-books are sold for free of charge, but they generate advertising revenues, contracts try to take into account this new form of remuneration. And the last point is that for authors, instead of earning 5 or 10% of the price, they receive about 70% of the price. Of course, the price is much lower than before, but they can be interesting in this new model. And it's a new model for remuneration of artists, of authors, and for property rights. So my second point, I have time? Yes? Okay. Is about the unfair competition with platforms. there is an intrinsic efficiency of platforms like Netflix, Amazon, etc. And the competition is unfair because of the ability of these platforms, of the companies, for tax optimization. For example, in France only, Google has to pay, I don't know if they will pay, but has to pay 1.6 billion euros to the tax administration because they did not pay their taxes. And in the UK, there was an agreement for Google to pay 172 million euros in 2016. So these platforms are success stories. For example, Netflix started 15 years ago as a DVD subscription service. It is the largest video distribution network in the world at this time. And it has been disruptive for the existing industries. For example, a blockbuster company went bankruptcy, and they have, at this time, they have more than 80 million subscribers in the world, and they open in 190 countries. But the revenue, the annual revenue, seemed to be very high, $6.8 billion this year. But the profits are very low, 30 million euros in 2016. And we face a kind of tension between the number of users and the low level of profits. And even Amazon faces big losses. And in spite of free riding strategies, for example, they use telecom infrastructure without contributing to the costs of the networks. And there is a second tension relying on the relationship between the organization of IPs and platforms. And for example, there is a conflict between copyright territoriality and the purpose of market integration due to EU directives. And geo-blocking frustrates users because they cannot, for example, if you have a subscription of Netflix and you want you are viewing a film, and then if you cross the frontier, it stops. And this problem raises many questions about the ability of these platforms to build business models which could be really and to earn money in this new world. And my third point, okay. My third point is about price discrimination in this new area. The dominant model on internet is price discrimination. Generally, access can be free of charge, and then prices depend on the willingness to pay of the subscriber. And of course, this model exists in the real world of culture, in theaters, books, etc. But with internet, we have to define a structure of prices that allows the amortization of costs. And I can give the example of streaming in music, which is rising very quickly. And at this time, global music revenues increased 3.2%, as digital revenues overtake physical for the first time. And for example, Spotify, which is the biggest streaming platform, has 30 million subscribers and 2 billion revenues, but at a loss of 173 million euros. And how can we understand that? It's kind of paradox because streaming reaches many subscribers. There are many advantages for users, the access to the infinity of titles, the renunciation to property, and targeted recommendations. But the explosion in consumption is not returning a fair remuneration for artists and labels, and there is a kind of economic paradox. The profitable consumer for the platform is, of course, a small consumer, because each time you consume a title, the platform has to pay royalties to the label, but the subscriber is a big consumer, and therefore platforms lose money. And the solution is probably in the size of the platform. It is a condition of for profitability, many subscribers, and the ability to negotiate with labels and artists and to pay very low remuneration to artists. And at a risk, of course, the risk is that a few companies dominate the market, and it is a risk for creativity, for artists, and for cultural diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, François. Shall I? Yes, Andy Pratt, yes.
Hi. I wanted to raise the issue that you touched upon there, and to is the question of power It's a question of power in relation to this. I mean, the point about bundling is one that's well made, but also that was how the film industry started, A and B movies. You know, so you bundle the bad movies with the good ones to make sure the product gets out there. So that's an old organisational form, and that was achieved by the power of the film producers and over the distribution, and that's what led to the separation of that in the US through regulation. So this issue of monopoly power is really important in all of this, and the issue that you've talked about addresses the issue, many of the issues of market, but in relation to copyright, the issue of power, simply having the law doesn't mean that you get restitution from the law, and I think that whole issue of whether you consumers actually have equal power to the corporates who will just threaten you with taking you to court, and basically they have all the money, even though the law doesn't support them. Big problems there, I think, in terms of whether markets actually can operate in this way.
Okay, well, I think perhaps that's a big question that we'll be coming back to.
Okay.
Can I now ask Mark to
Yes, sure. So thanks again for the invitation. So it's nice to be here. So I'm gonna talk mainly about the music industry. So I tend to be a very focused guy. So my interest is mainly on music. And so what I'm going to say about music does not necessarily apply to other cultural industries like books or movies. So I will also take the perspective of an industrial economist, looking at the music market. So what we've seen is that, as Joel has already explained, digitization has sharply transformed the music market, and I will talk about two main changes that have affected copyright or copyright policy. So first, the change of business models that we've seen in the music market, and secondly, I will talk about vertical integration of artists or creators into the commercialization or distribution of their music. So something that we can call self-releasing. So let me first start with the first topic, the fact that business models have changed. So history started, or the future started in 1999, and at that time, prior to digitization, the music industry was centered upon a traditional business model where recorded music was sold as music CDs or music LPs. And digitization and piracy have challenged this traditional business model, And what we've seen is some sort of big bang of business models where many different companies, incumbent firms, new entrants have tried many different types of business models, and more or less, and as time went by, then there has been some kind of convergence to the streaming platform business model that we see today. So Françoise has already talked about that, but just in terms of where the market stands right now. So in the US, 1/3 of sales comes from streaming, 1/3 from downloads on platforms like iTunes, and the last third is our old CDs. And it's clear that in the future, streaming will be more and more central in the recorded music industry. So this change of business models have had many different consequences, and I will mainly focus on 3 types of consequences. The first one is that because music labels generate less revenues from recorded music, they've changed the types of contracts that they offer to music artists. And so we've seen the rise of equity deals or 360 degrees deals with music artists, whereby the music labels now manage all the music-related activities of an artist. So recorded music, sales of albums, of course, but also live performances and other types of sales. And for example, in France now, artists say that when they are proposed an artist contract, then what they are proposed is a 360 degrees contract only. So this is the first consequence, and it makes sense because there have been a lot of work showing that there is some kind of externality, positive externality between recorded music sales and sales of concert tickets, and so it makes sense to see these maybe more efficient 3 degrees contracts. Although the artists are kind of reluctant to sign these types of contracts because they've had some bad experiences with music labels that little bit cheat with the artist, and sometimes the artists are little bit labels take a little bit advantage of the music artist. So the second consequence of the new business models is that so in the past it was important for a music label to have a large catalog of rights, sure, but it's more and more important. And in particular, because on streaming platforms, what we see is that compared to the CD market, the consumers listen more and more to old stuff compared to new stuff. So the share of so-called catalog music albums is much higher on streaming platforms than it is in the CD market. For example, it used to be on the CD market anyway. So because of that, for example, we see some kind of firms, music labels buying other firms' catalogs, but we'll see also some kind of intermediaries that buy large catalogs from small labels and aggregate this catalog of rights. And there is some equivalence with what we see in the IP patent world, where there is what is called the patent pools, so private patent pools that buy a lot of patents from companies to create large catalog of IP rights and then be able to be in a strong position to negotiate terms with the IP users. And so here it's the same. I think we can see some analogy. And so this aggregation of catalog of rights is probably meant to have better terms with the streaming platforms. The third consequence is that the artists feel that they are worse off with these streaming platforms, so that they don't get a fair share of the value that is generated. And so just it's hard to see numbers, but well, a number that are more or less computed is that artists get about $4 for 1,000 streams, but it's extremely heterogeneous for various reasons. So the change of business models has had an impact for labels too. So in a paper that I published in the Journal of Cultural Economics with my co-authors François Moreau and Patrick Wedbrock, we studied the adoption of digitization, digital tools, digital technologies by music labels, so in the early 2010 in France. And so what we saw using some production function model is that the record companies that had adapted to digitization at various stages were releasing more albums than the record companies that had not adapted, but without having overall higher sales. So they were selling the same amount of CDs, but with a larger variety, so, which is in line with the long tail theory or the long tail story. So this is the first change that I wanted to talk about, so change of business model. The second change that I would like to focus on now is vertical integration or self-releasing. So the fact that more and more artists now in the music industry self-release their music. So in IO terms, in industrial organization terms, we would talk about vertical integrations of creators into the commercialization of their creations. And so we've done a study with ADAMI, which is the French collective society for collection of rights for music artists in France, in fall of 2014. And so what we found is that 58% of the music artists that belong to ADAMI, so professional artists, had self-released an album in the last 3 years. So this is really a widespread phenomenon. And so, of course, one idea is that the artists can reap a larger share of the profits by vertically integrating into the distribution of their music. But there are also standard merits of vertical integration, like control of marketing or sales efforts. And one striking example related to what I've done lately is what the British rock band Radiohead did in 2007. So in 2007, if you remember well, and if you like Radiohead, then Radiohead became independent of its music label, EMI, and for their next album, In Rainbows, they decided to commercialize the album, release the album with some interesting and innovative releasing strategy. So what they did is that they set up a website to commercialize the new album, and for the digital version of the album, the consumers were able to pick their own price and even a zero price, up to some fee to cover financial cost for Radiohead. And the other interesting thing is that the operation stopped at the end of 2007, and later on Radiohead released the album in a standard way as a CD and as a digital download with a preset price. And so with Quarters, so I've looked at whether this innovative release strategy was a good thing, and in particular whether it cannibalized the later sales of the CD and digital version of In Rainbows. And what we found strikingly is that it did not cannibalize the digital sales, but rather expanded the digital sales compared to a counterfactual where Radiohead would have released In Rainbows in a traditional way. So artists can now self-release their music, but then you might wonder whether, well, the average artist, given that it's not Radiohead, can succeed in releasing its music artist. And obviously one important thing is whether also these artists can become visible to the consumers, whether they can promote efficiently to get the attention of consumers. So with colleagues, we've looked at 1,000 music artists that released a new album, so 2 years ago, and we've followed these artists in offline and online promotion channels over a period of 6 months. And our idea was to see whether the less well-known artists can use the digital technologies, and in particular the digital promotion channels, to get on a kind of level playing field with the superstars, with the idea, okay, if I'm an artist, I'm not well known, I can still use Facebook, I can still use Twitter, I can still use YouTube to promote my music. And so there are two views of online channels. So one standard view would be to say, well, online channels are just additional channels compared to offline channels like press or TV and so on. And what we found is that then nothing changes. So the most famous artists are the one who takes the best advantage of the new online channels. There is another view, though, that the artists themselves can now promote themselves on YouTube. They can use Twitter intensively, Facebook intensively. However, what we found is that the less well-known artists are not more active on these platforms than the most well-known artists. So it's a little bit pessimistic, but there is a kind of ray of sun, though, which is the fact that what we found, interestingly, is that the fans of the less well-known artists are much more active than the fans of the most well-known artists on these Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook platforms. So they make a lot of effort to advertise their artists, the artists that they like, and to make sure that they are promoted to the rest of the market. So there is some kind of optimistic conclusion to that, so that the self-released artists can now use digital tools like the home studio to self-release, but there is also a chance to use the digital technologies to self-promote effectively. And I will stop here.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Shall we take one question to Mark? Well, I'll save my questions for later to him. I'm sure that other people will think of ones later.
It's technology.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. I'm going to mention that. Okay, I think we've discussed the ham or the jamon, as it might be called here, to some extent, and I'm going to not bore you with my much more modest research output of late, but let me try to put a sandwich around what we've heard. So first I'm going to try to talk about what has cultural economics to offer in this context of the rise of a digital creative economy. And second, what is the future? And I'm going to be perhaps even more ambitious, but less well-founded as what we've heard so far. So let's first stay on safe ground and talk about cultural economics and what it may have to offer to the rest of the world, including economists. Now, I think that in our community, there are relatively advanced debates on a number of topics. First, the cost disease of labor-intensive production that many people I know are currently debating in the context of Industry 4.0 or 4.0, as even English speakers sometimes call it these days, because apparently that was coined in people interested in German manufacture in particular. Second, taste formation, socially interdependent demand and superstar effects, and the complex process in which we come to appreciate creations that have no clearly defined function. At least we can't put a finger on it, we can't measure it. Why do we like that painting rather than another? Third, intrinsic motivation to create, communicate, and generate value. Fourth, how to identify public goods and how to promote their provision. Fifth, cultural economists share a sustained interest, for instance, with innovation economists on decision-making under far-reaching uncertainty. And sixth, some of us know a lot about how to organize production in flexible teams. I believe that these debates in our community that have been going on for decades, for as long as the discipline exists in the case of some of these points, give us an edge and a responsibility to see to it that these issues are actually considered in the public debate regarding the digital creative economy. I believe that this should not happen sporadically and in parts, but systematically and in conjunction. Often, several of these points need to be considered, or issues need to be considered to arrive at practically relevant policy implications, for instance, or as far as we can devise them in any case. I'm thus convinced that cultural economists have a lot to offer regarding a broad range of policies. To do so, I think we have to do two things. First, stay on top of the literature, say regarding information economics, innovation, and relate that to our work explicitly. Second, take an active interest in the new shapes of creative works and relevant social practices that are emerging and not focus only on traditional arts that are very important, and we learned a lot from studying them and we continue to do so, but they are partially displaced, replaced, but I think there's a lot to learn from what we understand about traditional arts markets, for instance, in trying to shape the future that will be more and more digital, I suppose. All right, I suppose I do have time to move on to the predictions of the future, if I may be so bold.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Okay.
2 minutes will be great.
2 minutes would be great. So then I will, that was roughly what I intended anyway. So predictions of the future. I think it's quite clear that well, let me skip a couple of points and say that at the risk of sounding overly optimistic, with more abundant and less costly information on the quality of creative products and lower costs of creation, I don't think we'll only see more abundant supply. I also think that we might see a better correspondence between, well, let's call it more reliable market selection. That it will depend less on the promotion campaigns and so on, and perhaps more on the actual intrinsic appeal of works, which ones will become hits. We've heard already that I don't think the superstar economy is going out, and I don't think the long tail will even things out very much more. At least my reading of the empirical evidence isn't that that's really happening. But I think what will become a hit might be more reliably associated with, intrinsic qualities of the works. What intrigues me most personally, and Andy Pratt will be happy to hear that, is regards the role of intermediaries, contestability, and centralized control. There has been much talk of disintermediation, not so much in this panel, so I can dare to say that I think that the notion of disintermediation in the context of the digital creative economy has been deeply, profoundly misleading. Clearly enough, some aspects of production have become obsolete, fair enough, but we have seen the rise of new digital intermediaries. We have seen the platforms, let's call it Amazon for the big book market, to spare you a longer list. So this intermediary in many large, important economies is more concentrated than anything we've ever seen in the economy of the 1990s, where we already were very worried about market power in the cultural industries. So that clearly raises the issue of centralized control. I think many people make it too easy for themselves, including many expert economists that I dare to disagree with here, by alluding to contestable markets. I think there's a great probability that contestability will be much, much lower as the digital creative economy matures and the sequence of radical innovations slows down, and will be perhaps if the history of technology is anything to go by, and we don't fall into the trap of saying, oh, this time is really different than anything we've ever observed so far. So if this speed and radicalness or disruptiveness of innovation will slow down at some point, we need to be prepared to deal with the winners. To deal with those companies that already have very much market share and will be increasingly less challenged by new market entrants. That would at least be something that is so probable, in my opinion, that we need to be prepared. There need to be checks and balances, and economists traditionally have been involved in these kind of issues and checks and balances and trying to restrict excessive market power. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So a question for Christian. Yes.
It might also relate to Joel Waldvogel's talk, and it's about this notion of market power and, say, the power of Netflix or major publishers to, when a self-published book or something outside of the traditional channels becomes successful, to immediately buy that up and include it in whatever bundle of goods they are offering. So I'm just wondering, as a researcher, in terms of empirical strategies, how would you go about saying something meaningful about contestability when this seems to be one of the major factors that is going on? So every small initial success is almost immediately sort of taken up by one of the big publishers. So it looks like a very uncontestable market because these big publishers they are big and they dominate the market, but on the other hand, they are very open firms. So in a sense, you could say that they're very contestable. So I was wondering whether the researchers have any ideas on how we get a good grip on those sorts of processes.
Thank you very much. Christian, it's a question to you.
Yes, I find that question difficult to answer because it now looks at the traditional. I mean, what's different from platforms and from traditional intermediaries such as publishers is that the publishers tend to finance creation, whereas platforms don't, with very few exceptions that I'm aware of, but by and large they don't. What they usually do is they say, you take the risk, when you're here with a finished product, I'm happy to help you access potential buyers, and I take a cut. That's very different, and that usually is associated with a strategy where there's little gatekeeping in the sense of trying to control what is actually being sold and so on, because you get a cut anyway, right? But I think the issue of market power goes much further sooner or later, because what if you write a book about, let's say, Eric Schmidt? Is he still involved with Google? I suppose so, or what's now Alphabet, right? That is not really liked. Or let's think about the conflict between Hachette and Bonnier and Amazon, where Hachette and Bonnier would have liked a different pricing strategy, prices for ebooks and in proportion to prices for physical books. They weren't too happy with it, and Amazon just decided to make it difficult to buy their works on Amazon. That kind of control could easily turn into something that I would find distasteful, not only for questions of finance and the distribution of the revenue pie or whatever, but also in terms of ultimately putting restrictions on what is being easily available to a wide public. We already have it, only in areas where it's not very offensive, say nudity. Yeah? On YouTube, you won't find many things that interest many people, and others are clearly available that might be offensive. Now, I'm not sure I answered your question, and in terms of empirical strategies, I think both Mark and Joel might be, actually much greater authorities on developing empirical strategies regarding this issue.
Yes, maybe I can add something. For authors, this question of power is very unbalanced because on the one side they earn more power because of the possibility of disintermediation, because of self-publishing, because of the existence of social networks where they can build their reputation inside the community. But on the other side, they lose completely their power because of the power of the giants, generally American giants, and their ability to develop locked models, because the infinite diversity and the difficulty to find an audience on internet, and because there are billions of pages of titles, etc. And the third point is the low level of revenues, except for artists who are involved in performing arts at the same time as in digitized music, as Mark said before.
Thank you. Joel, I think you might have something to say on this.
Oh, I'm strongly of two minds about the concern about an agent like Amazon. I mean, on the one hand, so Amazon 2 years ago or so bought Goodreads. Goodreads was a repository of 20 million reviews, and along with Amazon then essentially had a stranglehold on all the information about books. I thought it was a little strange that nobody cared when that happened. But when I look at Amazon and try to find things they're doing to harm the market, except for their little scuffle with the publishers, it's hard to find many damages, because I mean, what's happened is that authors self-publish. Amazon is a passive platform. They're a gatekeeper, but they're a passive gatekeeper, so anybody can put his or her stuff there. If you think a 70% cut is a good deal, that is a 30% cut for Amazon, if you think that's reasonable, then you think this is a great world. But some people do argue that the 30% cut that the Amazons and the Apples take is kind of high, maybe collusively high, and you'd like to see competition reduce that 30% to something lower. So I guess I'm giving you that annoying two-handed economist answer. On the one hand, in principle, I'm distressed by the concentration of Amazon. On the other hand, as long as they remain a passive platform, I see them engaged in less harmful activity. And we have to keep an eye on them, but I can't seem to find the harm that I keep imagining that they're going to do. I mean, they must be laying in wait to eventually, predatorily price, but not yet. Shareholders are happy to finance them and let them lose money indefinitely.
Yes, well, Mark, would you like to comment on this? Or? No, okay, so yes.
I would like to briefly respond to this. I'm also optimistic about these things, but as an economist, I would also say that if there's an incentive, if there's financial gains to be had by not being a perfectly neutral, I don't want to call it gatekeeper, but platform, then somebody will try at some point. And I don't know whether Amazon does, but that's my very point. It's intransparent. Who would know if, say, any platform, I don't want to say any names in this context, but obviously you don't have that information, but who would know if they would make it less likely that you would find certain books or certain works? I don't think anybody would. I spoke about this with policymakers, activists. Many people are surprised when this question is raised, and maybe we should go with the wisdom of the crowd, and maybe I'm just off kilter here, but I don't think anybody would know. If they're half clever, and they, as long as it's not too obvious, they think there's great scope for manipulation, and I think society needs to be prepared when somebody starts trying. And whether they've started already or not is almost besides the point, in my opinion. We need to be prepared.
Can I just take that up, perhaps with Françoise or with Mark, which is, what are regulators doing about these things? It seems to me always that there is a great growth of concentration, and contestability is perhaps, at least in the short term, is difficult. But where are there's a great deal of complaint about the effect of copyright as a monopoly, or offering monopoly power, but we see very little regulation of these very big industries. Is that a concern?
Yes, you are. Yes, you are absolutely right. The regulation, regulation is overall national, and these companies are totally globalized, and it's very difficult to build regulations facing these kind of companies because they escape the traditional tools of regulations, and that is one of the problems. And at this time there is a beginning of consultation, cooperation between countries, for example with OECD about tax policies. But it's very difficult to catch the problem because we don't have the tools.
Mark, yes, please.
Just to follow up with what Christian said and what Joel said, and that will answer, maybe give some insight on your question about regulation. So Joel said that as long as Amazon is a passive gatekeeper, then basically everything is fine. So we should not be so concerned. So one question, though, is on all these online platforms like Spotify, Netflix, and Amazon, what is key is the recommendation algorithms that actually help consumers find something relevant in a notion of potential titles. And so the question then is whether these algorithms are neutral or how are they designed in which sake. So obviously we should, as economists, we should think that these algorithms are designed in a way that help the firms to maximize their profits. And for example, to the extent that these firms don't get the same terms with all the publishers, then maybe they might have incentive to bias their algorithms towards the publishers that provide better terms. And then going forward, that means that the big publishers may have incentive to negotiate contracts with the platforms, the intermediaries that provide actually the intermediaries with the incentives to bias the recommendations. In which case, market power or platform would be problematic and through these algorithms in particular.
Ario, you had a question. Have you got a microphone?
Yeah, there's more questions there. I would like to make 2 points. First of all, when we talk about the digital creative economy, you usually are getting very enthusiastic, a little bit Joe's line, great, fantastic. But it's good, it behooves us economists to also point out the shadow side, which I'm glad the panel does, that there are power issues. And I would like to link that with the economics of attention, because that's one side of the economics of attention, the inexorable law, winner takes all. But there's another side, which I also observe, and I haven't heard you talking about, because what is the response to it is clustering, localizing. And we see actually that through digital technologies, local initiatives really thrive now, and that means, and that's a completely different issue, but that's more an optimistic way of presenting it. That's one. And second is, what I also observe, especially among my students, that they really get fed up with the enormous amount of information that comes their way with Facebook, with Twitter, with WhatsApp. And what they desire most is to have a world without it. And we see in Silicon Valley people sending their kids to schools with iPads. You guys have decided to get rid of PowerPoint for this case. I think that there is a sort of undercurrent that undermines exactly what you are talking about. And the question is where that leaves us.
Anybody like to... Christian, you've got your microphone. Would anyone like to respond to that? About attention. I mean, I did a lot of work for this thing because I got very behind in industrial organization. And the fact is that instead of having to go to the library and order the books and have the journal issue produced for me by a librarian or found it on a shelf, I could just sit in my office at home and look up all the journals in the world, look up everybody's papers. I read the papers of all the people here. I mean, that, it's an incredibly time-saving device. May offer the wrong thing, but that's part of it. Now, Victor, you have a question.
Yes, I have a problem understanding exactly what happens with Amazon publishing. I have a friend who had 2 books published in the so-called White Collection at Gallimard, which is a sort of, in France, is a sort of really high, I mean, a very good, Gallimard is a good publisher, and the Collection Blanche is really a serious stuff. He now decided, he wrote a 3rd book, and he decided to go to Amazon. Now, apparently at Amazon, there are 2 stages. You can publish your book at your own risk, of course, as a sort of electronic book. There was no problem. But then he faced a 2nd stage. He asked whether they would like to publish it in print. And they said yes, but there was a sort of gatekeeping, because we know that you have 2 books that have been published by Gallimard in the Collection Blanche, so we are ready to publish your book in printed form. But he said, fortunately, I had these 2 books at Gallimard, because otherwise they may not have published me. So my question is, there seem to be 2 stages. One, you just put your book as an electronic book, and 2, you get published, but there is some sort of gatekeeping. I don't know whether I understood correctly what he told me, but that seems to be like that. So I would like to have more information.
So Amazon has 2 ways, as I understand it, 2 ways in which you can publish. One is if you simply join the Kindle Direct publishing program, you upload a PDF, you charge $5 or more for it, you keep 70%, they keep 30%. If you want to sell physical copies of the book, they'll print those on demand and sell them, but they cannot get them into bookstores. So Amazon still is unable to distribute through physical bookstores, so it's really not a good method for that. There's a second method, though, in which Amazon is a gatekeeper. Amazon's not just a passive publisher, they're also an active publisher. They've set up a whole bunch of publishing imprints. And what they do, and with those, believe me, they don't give 70% of the revenue to the author. It's secret what they do give, but it's surely less than 70%. In those cases, they use their ability to promote, and perhaps this is some corrupt form of steering, or perhaps it's just good old-fashioned promotion, but they act just as traditional publishers, with the only feature being that they again can't get your book into a physical bookstore. So they do have a gatekeeping feature. I mean, one thing I want to say, though, about this issue of power that shows up in the Amazon case, it also shows up in the movie platform cases, is that although Amazon has an enormous market share and so forth, the major publishers have not bought into Amazon's bundled distribution schemes. You know, the Kindle Unlimited program, which is, I think, 70,000 titles you don't want to read, or 700,000 titles that you don't want to read, for $10 a month. The majors aren't in there because they're trying to prevent it from becoming the bottleneck through which they must pass. Look at Netflix. It has, 6,000 movies in the US, most of which you don't want to see because the major movie studios do not want Netflix to become the bottleneck through which they must pass. So although there may be a role for regulation, and I would strongly, whenever I'm in Europe, I ask people who know regulators to compel the Amazons of the world to disclose data because we don't know anything about consumption of products. But, before we get to regulation, let's just think about how competition is going to play out. There are some interesting death struggles between upstream producers and platforms. There's that big media bug again. Yeah. But, the studios are taking their movies away from Netflix precisely because, and Netflix is becoming a studio itself. And the major publishers aren't distributing their electronic books through the bundled program of Amazon. So I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that'll happen in markets, potentially staving off the sort of the nightmare concerns we have about concentrated players. Just the last point to make in the platform competition area is that there's also a competition between bundled and a la carte sales. So we keep talking about Amazon as this scary downstream player, and indeed, Amazon does have a bundled service, Prime, which contains music and movies and books, again, the ones you don't want to read, watch, or see. They also, and those are very limited numbers of titles, say on the order of 4,000 movies. But Amazon Instant is an a la carte streaming program, which has 35,000, last time I checked, 35,000 movies and television series, which dwarfs the number of products available through any other platform. And since you don't have to subscribe to consume via that platform, it seems much less of a threat as long as they remain passive in what they allow on the platform. But the struggle between the a la carte approach and the bundled subscription access approach is going to be an interesting one. If Netflix were to win and the market were to tip, then we would very likely have something we need to worry about. And then I'd get back to the notion that we really need to compel some data out of these entities. No one knows what consumption is on Amazon, Netflix. We know a little bit about Spotify. Okay, enough about that.
My point was really that there is some gatekeeping if you want to go see it.
Yeah, no, and that's right. When you publish through Amazon via one of their imprints, it's just like a traditional publisher, except it's the one that for digital distribution really controls a large part of the market.
Do I have time? No, I had a different question. I was intrigued by some of the presentations on what might happen in the future of the creative economy in terms of new complementarities and substitutability among goods. Because what you have said, in a sense, is that the new digital economy creates some substitutes for the physical product. So you'll substitute digital product, physical product with digital product. But I was wondering whether instead there might be created in the future new complementarities with the real performances. So concerts, going directly to museum, going directly to art galleries, to have the real experience. This afternoon we'll talk about the experience economy, joyful economy in terms of experiences. Are you finding these new complementarities in the sense that the increase of the digital consumption and enjoyment goes parallel with maybe living then the goods in real life? Experiencing the good in performances, museum, and so on.
Well, if nobody minds, I would like to answer that briefly. I don't see David Throsby here, but he's one of the people who's done work on this question of complementarity. Well, David, I think you could speak for yourself. Can we get the microphone to David? The thing is that there is both substitutability and complementarity. It goes on. People, are getting very different museum experiences. Museums are actually putting on performing art performance events, so that, for example, what was the Pompeii exhibition in the British Museum created a whole film and a whole thing around it. So that's, anyway, David, I'd like...
Yeah, there is no question that there is a complementarity and that it is developing, and that the experience of the digital product, whether it's a performance or whether it's going to an exhibition or whatever, does seem to create a desire for the real thing. And I think this comes back to the whole question of authenticity as part of the cultural experience. And that's something which cannot be replaced by the digital experience. Mind you, there may also be new cultural experiences which are only digital, and that brings us into another sort of dimension. But if you're thinking in terms of traditional ways of consuming cultural products, like listening to music or looking at artworks or whatever, then that complementarity certainly does exist. While I've got the microphone, if I could just make a comment about the question of regulation, which I think is really intriguing, because I'm sure Françoise is quite right that regulation is difficult, although maybe not impossible, but certainly made difficult by the fact that these corporations are global. You mentioned, Françoise, that the question of taxation, and that is something which is a very current concern to many countries. There's also the question about the need for regulation in the public interest. The reason why we have regulation, of course, is to support the public interest, and that might be through creating economic efficiency, through prohibition of monopoly and so on, and preventing exploitative pricing. But there are also broader senses in which the public interest may be protected by regulation. There's been some comment, I think Joel made a comment about local cultures or about protection of culture. And of course the word protection in an audience of economists is always a difficult word to say, but it may be that the question of safeguarding of local cultural expressions is something which does need to be considered in the context of that this discussion has been about. Thank you.
Thank you, David. I mean, I myself have been very interested in this question of opera because, of course, the opera, you know, Baumel's Cost disease obviously was most concentrated in something like opera, where opera houses often don't have more than 1,000 seats. So what opportunity do they have for economies of scale? Well, now they have a huge opportunity. But then you ask the question, if you can go to your local cinema and see the Metropolitan Opera producing whatever, you know, are you going to go to the local, you know, whatever it is, touring opera that comes to your theatre nearby? And I believe that the downside of this is going to be that there's much more concentration in the superstar brands, and this actually also relates to Ario's point because the essentially, I mean, people don't have the time to to do everything, so they tend to focus. This is really the superstar consumption network theory that people focus on the things that they know and they hear about from other people. So.
Hi, I wanted to just follow up the point about data, basically. And if we're talking about regulation, this issue of transparency and our ability to be able to both see the makeup of the algorithms and also see the data that they're based upon. With these new players, and also with the digital basis of sales, we don't see the sales. We don't have the information in the same way. We have some processed information about sales, etc. But if you want to get into regulation and be able to compare things, this is just not available at the moment. I think we've got to press for this because you don't even have the evidence basis on which to regulate. And many of the debates, not just about taxation, but about Google and Apple's businesses and many of the other majors, is about the way that they're able to keep undercover this data, and therefore questions about transparency and about exactly the form of the algorithms. And you know, there's been a long debate about those people that say do no evil. Google's algorithms are extremely questionable, and we've seen material actions that have been taken by Google removing certain people from their platforms, etc., etc. So this stuff can and does happen. So how do we get this data, and how do we force people to reveal this data? How do we get access to that so we can actually carry on some proper analysis of it?
I totally agree. So there is some kind of paradox that with digitization, we potentially have tons of data about consumption of music, of movie, and so on. And actually, given that this data is proprietary to platforms, then actually it turns out that we have less data on music consumption, movie consumption, than we used to in the old world. So this is paradoxical, and I agree with you that we should have more transparency on that, at least to have a gross idea of what's going on.
Well, after the Brexit vote goes the right way, and we'll just get Brussels to compel the data out. I mean, honestly, the Anglo-American regulatory approach, I don't think we'll ever get any data, but it's possible Europeans could get Amazon, Apple to share some, or not share, to compel them to provide some data to see what's going on, and that would be good.
On the topic of regulation, there are about 16 prosecutions against Alphabet, Google, at this time in Europe.
Well, time is up. It seems to have gone very fast from our point of view. I hope it has from your point of view. One of the things we haven't discussed at all is copyright, which is fair enough. But it does seem to me that one of the issues that we should consider in a sort of very broad sense coming out of these discussions is that cultural policy should no longer be confined just to the sort of idea of arts councils and so on. But cultural policy also must be considered in a most broad sense with industrial policy. And with copyright, that these things are now very much intertwined. And in fact, to just consider what the economics of museums is, or just to consider what the economics of opera is or something, isn't good enough without these much wider considerations. Digitization has meant that it competes in different markets, that different issues come up, certainly with rights for artists and copyrights for companies and all the rest of it. So these are very broad questions to which unfortunately we haven't found one single answer, but I think myself, and I think we've proved here, that the answer does lie in understanding much more industrial organization relating to the internet and to a digital economy. So thank you all very much.
Thank you. Thank you.